Tom Dewal, thank you for being with us. The year 2016 is coming to an end. How did the year, do you think, change Azerbaijan and Armenia?
I think it changed both Azerbaijan and Armenia, and not in a positive way. Obviously, the major event was the resumption of conflict over Karabakh, if only for a few days, but certainly with tragic consequences, perhaps as many as 200 people being killed. But also, of course, in domestic developments, we saw further economic problems in Azerbaijan. We saw some social protests. We've seen the further devaluation of the manat, and we've seen some political crisis in Armenia in the summer. So it's not been a good year, I think, for either country.
Now, the April War, we haven't seen that intense fighting in years. What were the lessons? How did it change your knowledge of the region? How is it different from the times when you traveled, when you wrote the book, Karabakh, The Black Garden? How was it different, this fighting?
Well, unfortunately, the fighting, of course, was a surprise, but not a surprise in the sense that when you don't have a political resolution of a problem, then and you have military build-up, then of course there's always a danger of violence and of young people being killed, which is what happened. Obviously, we can talk about many different causes, but obviously a sense of frustration on the Azerbaijani side is obviously a major cause, a feeling that after so many years nothing had moved, and that's therefore it was legitimate to try and use military force, military pressure to try and change the status quo, to remind the world about this conflict. Even if one understands that feeling, of course, it's very dangerous because no conflict continues as people understand. It begins and can get out of control. And of course, this conflict was stopped after 4 days, but there's every danger that there could be a new round of fighting, perhaps next year, which could be even worse. So I fear that both sides learned some bad lessons from the 4-day war. That it increases domestic popularity. That Karabakh is a cause which means that people forget about domestic problems, and it's a useful political instrument.
What is the political instrument, do you think it is? I mean, how did it help the governments
Well,
in Azerbaijan and Armenia?
on both sides, it made people forgot about their socio-economic problems for several days, and they, as we say, rallied around the flag, and they competed to be patriotic on both sides, on the Azerbaijani side and the Armenian side. In Azerbaijan, people forgot about the state of the economy. In Armenian side, people forgot about the Karabakh clan that is ruling the country. And in many cases, people were quite enthusiastic about the fighting. So in that sense, it was a political instrument.
You keep mentioning a political instrument. 8 months later, what is your conclusion as to what actually triggered this 4 days war?
Well, of course, it's impossible to say, but I think even in Azerbaijan, I think there's a widespread acceptance that this conflict was more in the interests of the Azerbaijani side. The Armenian side does not want to change the status quo. The normalization of the status quo suits them very well. It's the Azerbaijani side, the losing side of the war of the 1990s, who wanted to shake things up and to change things. Of course, there were incidents on the ground on both sides, but I think what started it was certainly this frustration on the Azerbaijani side.
But nothing to do with the military frustration. Are you saying it's a frustration with socio-economic situation?
No, frustration with the status quo and in the Karabakh conflict, frustration that nothing has moved in 20 years, and that feeling that something needs to be done to shake things up, and therefore a decision to use limited force. Obviously, not it wasn't a major military operation, but to have a limited operation in Karabakh.
Tom, the idea of the war when people die on both sides, young people die, and that this can be a political instrument which can be used whenever needed, actually scares me. Does it mean that if the situation or frustration get worse, there will be new fightings? The instrument will be used again?
Yes, well, of course. I mean, when I say political instrument, it's not out of nothing. Clearly, there is, on the Azerbaijani side, a legitimate grievance, a feeling of loss that need to be corrected after years. But I'm talking, when I say political instrument, it was the decision at that moment to do something about it. But certainly, yes, there is a danger that if there is no political progress in negotiations, then that we will see another round of fighting, and we can almost put a date on it. It would be the spring of 2017 when the winter is over, and we could unfortunately see another round of fighting in the Karabakh conflict zone. Unfortunately, this is quite a danger. There's quite a lot of diplomatic activity led in particular by Sergei Lavrov, but I don't see it making enough progress.
Now, you clearly have been following these conflict for years. Do you see any change in the peace negotiations now that the administration in the United States has changed and there's somehow more close relations between the two major co-chairs in the negotiations?
Well, I think there's always a lot of more activity behind the scenes than we see in public. These are obviously always very secret negotiations, and that's, by the way, not necessarily because of the co-chairs, but more because of the two presidents prefer it that way. But I think it's a bit early to say what will happen with a Trump presidency. Obviously, we're still a few weeks away from the beginning of a Trump presidency, and I don't think Karabakh will be high up the agenda. Some kind of rapprochement with Russia may be high up the agenda, but I have to say that this is one issue where the US and Russia have worked quite well together for many years. There's even, when someone like Matt Breiser, who had many difficulties with Russia, was the co-chair on Karabakh, he still had a good working relationship with the Russians on this issue. So it's one issue where it's not 100% agreement, but it's a maybe 80 or 90% agreement between the US and Russia. But I've always said that, of course, there is a geopolitical aspect to this conflict, but the prime reason for this conflict is a local reason. It's a local conflict, and the key decisions are taken not in Moscow or Washington, but in Baku and Yerevan.
You mentioned Matt Breiser, who after his career as the co-chair and U.S. diplomat works for one of the sides to the conflict. Now another U.S. co-chair, James Warlick, also resigning and will be working for Russia. Is it becoming a pattern?
I don't think so. Another former co-chair, Steve Mann, now works for, I believe he works for Exxon. These American diplomats need to find a job. But I don't think the job that Jim Warlick will be doing is as a lawyer. It's not a completely political job. He will be heading a law firm. Maybe he made his connections in Russia, but I don't think it's a very political job.
Now, speaking of Russia, Moscow weapons, Iskander rockets that it has provided to Armenia is a big deal for the region. It can, if it proves to be indeed what it is assumed to be, can indeed destroy, ruin its one of the sides, Azerbaijan. Should it worry the sides? Is it a legal issue that Azerbaijan is right to raise in front of the international community?
Well, I mean, certainly these are very powerful weapons, and the Armenians are hinting that they could be directed against Azerbaijani oil and gas infrastructure, maybe even against Sangarchar, military expert, and I don't know how realistic that is, but certainly it's a factor that we should take seriously. But we should also mention that Azerbaijan also has very destructive weaponry as well. It has missiles, aircraft. So this is also a factor that both sides have weapons which are 100 times more destructive than the weapons we saw in the 1990s. I see that here the cleaner behind me. Is that a problem? Should I ask her?
No. And also your forecast for 2017.
Well, 2016 was a bad year for many of us, and obviously in the Caucasus it was a bad year in Armenia, Azerbaijan. So we hope for the best, but we should also expect some bad things. Certainly, I believe that if there's not more intensive diplomacy, then the risk of new fighting is really quite high.
Tom De Waal, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.